Everyone assumes that smart people simply know more. But the shocking truth is that real intelligence has almost nothing to do with how much you know, and everything to do with how differently you process what's already in front of you. The real gap between someone who seems effortlessly sharp and someone who constantly feels behind isn't found in grades or memory. It lives entirely in the specific mental habits they've quietly built over years without ever being taught them in a classroom. Today I'm showing you 5 of those habits, not as abstract advice you'll forget by tomorrow, but as concrete shifts you can start making today that will immediately change how every person around you perceives your thinking. The reason most people never discover these habits isn't because they're too complex. It's because nobody ever slows down long enough to explain them in a way that actually sticks, which is exactly what we're doing right now. Once these 5 habits become part of how you naturally operate, people start gravitating toward you for guidance. Problems that used to paralyze you start feeling solvable, and that constant background noise of stress begins to fade in a way you genuinely didn't think was possible. The first habit will immediately separate you from almost everyone you know, because the default human response when someone disagrees with you is to treat that disagreement like a war that must be won, even when winning destroys the relationship and any chance of getting to the truth. Most people believe the goal of any disagreement is to prove the other person wrong. But what that approach actually produces is a defensive opponent who becomes more committed to their original position the harder you push against it. Smart people figured out that the moment you replace the instinct to argue with the genuine desire to understand, by asking questions like, "What made you see it that way?" the entire conversation shifts from combat to collaboration in a matter of seconds. When you stop fighting to be right and start asking to understand, the other person stops defending their position and starts actually examining it. And more often than not, they end up questioning their own thinking far more effectively than you ever could by arguing directly. This is the quiet power that intellectually sharp people carry into every conversation. Not the ability to out-argue anyone in the room, but the ability to ask the one question that makes the other person's own mind do all the work. The second habit is about the lens through which you interpret events. Because most people are trapped in a mode where one bad result means everything. One rejection means they're not good enough. And this kind of thinking actively prevents them from seeing the information that could help them improve. Smart people have trained themselves to zoom out automatically. When something goes wrong, they don't ask, "What does this mean about me?" They ask, "What does this tell me about the pattern?" Because a single data point is never a verdict. It's always just a signal pointing towards something that can be adjusted. When you look at a bad result and ask, "What pattern does this belong to?" instead of "What does this say about my worth?" you instantly transform a source of shame into a source of data. And data, unlike shame, actually gives you something useful to work with. The people who recover from setbacks faster than everyone else aren't recovering because they feel less. They're recovering faster because they've learned to treat rejection as information about fit and timing, rather than a final judgment about whether they deserve to succeed. Zooming out doesn't mean pretending problems don't exist. It means lifting your perspective high enough to see the full shape of the problem, which almost always reveals that what felt like an impossible wall from the inside is actually just one turn in a much larger maze that has an exit. The third habit will give you back more mental energy than almost anything else, because the average person burns an extraordinary amount of daily cognitive fuel worrying about things that exist entirely outside the boundary of what they can actually influence or control. Intellectually grounded people apply a simple filter to every worry before letting it take up space in their mind. If I cannot directly influence this outcome through any action I take today, then spending energy on it is not caution, it's waste. This isn't about becoming detached. It's about making a deliberate daily choice to direct your limited attention toward the variables you can actually move. Because those are the only variables that will ever genuinely change your situation. The moment you release the things you cannot control, not just intellectually, but emotionally, not just temporarily, but as a practiced habit, the mental space that opens up immediately fills with sharper thinking and a quality of calm that other people will start noticing without being able to explain why. You can't control the rain, but you can control whether you bring an umbrella. And that shift from resentment about what you can't change to preparation for what you can navigate is exactly the difference between someone perpetually drained by circumstances and someone who moves through difficulty with an almost frustrating ease. Two people walking into the same interview. One burning energy on the outcome they cannot control, one directing everything into the performance they absolutely can. Will have such profoundly different experiences in that room that it will look like they're playing entirely different games. The fourth habit is the one most people resist because it feels uncomfortable. The deliberate use of silence as an active tool, rather than an awkward gap to be filled as quickly as possible with whatever words happen to be available. When you pause before answering, not because you don't know what to say, but because you're choosing to think first, the person waiting subconsciously registers that pause as evidence that what's coming next is going to be worth their full attention. Listening without interrupting is one of the rarest and most powerful things you can do in any conversation. Because in a world where almost everyone is composing their response while the other person is still talking, the person who is genuinely present is experienced as someone exceptionally intelligent and worth confiding in. Try counting to 3 before you respond to the next question someone asks you. Not as performance, but as genuine thought. And you'll find that the answer emerging from those 3 seconds is consistently more precise and memorable than anything you'd have produced by reacting immediately. The people who seem consistently wise aren't carrying more knowledge than those around them. They've simply learned to create enough internal stillness that the knowledge they do have can surface clearly instead of being drowned out by constant reaction and anxious thought. The fifth and most transformative habit is the pause between stimulus and response. Because the single greatest difference between someone who consistently makes good decisions and someone who consistently regrets them is almost always the length and quality of that gap. When someone is rude and your instinct is to fire back immediately, you're handing that person complete control over your emotional state. But the moment you pause and ask what response actually serves me best, you take that control back, and everything that follows changes completely. The person in any room who maintains composure while everyone else reacts emotionally isn't just more pleasant to be around. They're operating with a cognitive advantage that directly translates into better judgment, better relationships, and a reputation for steadiness that people trust under pressure. You cannot control what happens around you on any given day, but you can absolutely control the quality of your response to those things. And that control over your response is the only leverage point that reliably produces better outcomes across every area of your life. What makes these 5 habits so powerful together is that they aren't 5 separate skills. They're 5 expressions of a single underlying shift from automatic reaction to deliberate response across every domain of your life. Most people will never practice these habits, not because they're incapable, but because changing a default pattern requires a kind of persistent, deliberate attention that most people never think to apply to their own thinking. But you are not most people, because most people don't seek out the mental frameworks that would allow them to think more clearly. And the fact that you're here right now means you're already operating with a different level of intentionality than the majority around you. When you start genuinely practicing even one of these habits, not perfectly but consistently, something begins to ripple outward into your relationships and your work in ways you couldn't fully predict before you started, but that become increasingly obvious the further you go. The single most common mistake people make with a list like this is trying to implement all 5 simultaneously, which almost always leads to overwhelm and eventually abandoning all 5. When the far smarter approach is choosing the one habit with the biggest immediate impact and making it completely automatic before adding another. Real, sustainable change in how you think never comes from dramatic overnight transformation. It comes from the patient daily repetition of one small shift until it becomes so embedded in your default behavior that you genuinely can't remember what it felt like to operate without it. If you start with asking questions instead of arguing, you'll notice within days that your conversations feel fundamentally different, less exhausting, more honest. And the people you talk with will start experiencing you as someone unusually easy to open up to, which changes everything about how they treat you. If you start with zooming out, you'll begin to notice that almost every problem you encounter has a shape with a beginning, variables, and a range of possible exits. And that shape is always visible from sufficient altitude, even when it's completely invisible from inside the problem. If you start with releasing what you can't control, you'll likely be surprised by how much mental bandwidth was being consumed by that worry, and how quickly that freed bandwidth converts into focus, creativity, and a quality of presence that feels almost like a different way of existing. If you start with using silence intentionally, you'll discover that the words you choose after a genuine pause carry a weight and clarity your unreflective responses never had. And people will begin listening to you differently. Not because you're saying more, but because every word now clearly means something. If you start with pausing before reacting, you'll find that the number of things genuinely deserving your emotional energy is far smaller than your automatic responses have been suggesting, and that the calm, considered reactions you produce in that pause consistently lead to outcomes your immediate reactions never could have generated. None of this is about becoming a different person. It's about making small, practiced adjustments to how you currently think that compound over time into something that genuinely looks and feels like a completely different level of intelligence to everyone around you. One of the clearest signs these habits are taking root is when people start coming to you with their hardest problems. Not because you've announced your capability, but because they've quietly noticed that conversations with you leave them feeling clearer and more capable than they felt before. The reputation for staying clear-headed under pressure is one of the most valuable things you can build, not because it looks impressive, but because it makes you genuinely useful in the moments that matter most, which is exactly when people remember who they can count on. Better decisions don't come from thinking faster. They come from thinking longer than your discomfort with uncertainty is comfortable with. Which is why the people who rarely regret their choices have learned to sit with a decision slightly longer than feels natural before committing. The most underrated way to accelerate these habits is to start talking about them with other people. Not to teach or impress, but to process. Because explaining a new way of thinking forces your brain to organize it more clearly than silent repetition alone ever could. If you want to keep building on what you started here, the most practical thing you can do right now is subscribe and turn on notifications, not as passive consumption, but as a deliberate commitment to keeping this kind of intentional thinking as a regular part of your week. Every time you interact with content like this, a like, a comment, a share, you're participating in the specific mechanism by which ideas that can genuinely help people actually reach the people who need them, which means that small action has a far larger downstream effect than it appears. Drop a comment right now telling me which of these 5 habits you're choosing to start with. Because the act of writing it down and committing publicly, even in a comment section, activates a different kind of accountability in your brain than a private intention ever does. You don't need a different life, a different background, or a different starting point to start thinking at a genuinely higher level. You just need to choose, repeatedly and deliberately, to respond to the world with these 5 habits instead of the automatic reactions that most people never once stop to examine.